Y'all can be seated. All right. Well, good evening. A more formal introduction. Here's the good news. It's not Song of Solomon tonight. I know you're thrilled, right? We've been teaching through Song of Solomon on Sunday. And this week was super awkward. Now we're not, they're not having to listen to me, and it's not Song of Solomon. Go ahead and grab a Bible and a notebook and a pen, something to write with or on. Let me tell you kind of the flow of this evening. Then we'll do a few introductions and we'll get off to the races. We kind of purpose-wise, if you rewind the tape 10 years ago or so, we started doing these kind of simple mini conferences. And the first one that we did as a church was cover to cover in the Bible in a weekend. Trying to go Genesis to Revelation, what's the big story of Scripture and how does it all fit together? And over the years, we've seen fit to just take various topics that either we want to be able to preach to with more length than our normal exposition will allow, or, and this is most common recently, topics that come up as the pastors are talking to you. Like, what are the things that we hear ourselves saying consistently? And we think kind of a mini conference would be really valuable to equip the church. And so some of the time, we do those as your pastors. We'll speak to the topic and address it, or we might share that. Sometimes we bring in somebody. Most recently, Chuck Lawless came and led us to consider the topic of spiritual warfare. And just what we've attempted to do, and the voices that we select from the outside, is pick trusted friends, perhaps more important trusted friends than just experts on a topic. And that's what we've done this weekend. So for the flow, I'm going to hand it to Jamie in just a moment, and he is going to do one of two sessions, one tonight, one tomorrow. Each time we do this conference, we get simpler, it seems. And so this is like the simple of the simple, two sessions. One tonight, one tomorrow. Tomorrow, after Jamie's second talk, we're going to do two breakouts. Jamie's wife, Tara, will lead one of those breakouts, and Dan will lead the other, and I'll introduce Dan in just a moment. And that's kind of the flow. After each of Jamie's talks, some of us are going to riff on the subject up here, okay? So tonight it's just going to be Jamie and I, and we're going to interact on questions that I have based on what he says, or questions that you ask. So most of you have my phone number. If not, it's going to be on the screens as we go. Feel free during Jamie's talk, if you have questions, you can text them to me. I would actually love that, because it would preload some questions for me to ask. Or in the 30 minutes or so afterwards, he and I are going to interact up here, so you can text those questions. We're going to try to put a hard stop on the night around 8:40 or so wiggly ones in the back, you can get them home and get everybody squared away. But that's kind of the simple flow of the night. I mentioned Jamie and Tara. Our lives actually have not overlapped, but they've kind of been on parallel paths since time at Southeastern, time in local church ministry, work that we've done with the Pillar Network, some degree stuff. And I told Jamie ahead, I just really stink at doing introductions. I really hate them. I feel super awkward when somebody's introducing me, and so I don't ever know how to introduce somebody else. So here's the simple, we just like Jamie and Tara a lot. They're just really cool people, and they've been faithful over a long period of time, loving and leading the church now as the president at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. Have two sets of twins. One set is 17 and 15. All right, so kind of similar lives as the Carsons and Rogers and company. We were all schooling in and around the same time, and so it's just cool to continue to do ministry together. Jamie's going to tell you more of his story, and then Tara is going to lead a breakout tomorrow on particularly how to deal with the subject directed to kids or to other people that you love and are kind of interacting with. So Jamie's going to focus more primarily on doubt personally, like I'm dealing with this subject. Tara in her breakout is going to help think towards how do we give care to other people that are thinking about that. And then Dan, you come on up, because you all got a copy of Dan's book. And if I stink at doing introductions, I stink at promoting somebody else's book worse than I stink at introductions. Dan is a new friend to me. He's a local guy in Travelers Rest and works for Desiring God with Piper and Company. And he can share a bit about what he does. But more importantly, just ask, why did you write the book? What did you hope to accomplish with the book? And then he's going to lead our other breakouts tomorrow. So I'm going to pass that.
Thanks, Mac. It's great to be here with you and been looking forward to this for some time. I was born to Christian parents who were heavily involved in church ministry vocationally, and I came to faith as a young child. And I've always been, ever since I was a young child, severely introspective. And so I was always examining, even as a 6, 7, 8-year-old, my faith. Was it genuine? My repentance, was it genuine? And that turned into a couple of decades of just wondering if I'm genuinely saved, and going through deep seasons of really despairing doubt, and often hiding that, keeping that to myself, but just tormented. And that began to show itself in many different ways in my middle school and high school years, and even into my college years. And I was training for pastoral ministry in college, and still wrestling with these things quite profoundly. And then the Lord took us through a number of pretty severe trials where that doubt would raise its head again. We had a 3-year-old son who died 20 years ago, and that was, it opened the door for that doubt to resurface in quite a profound way. And the Lord was very gracious through it all. One of the texts that I went to often was 2 Corinthians 1, where Paul says he despaired even of life itself, but that happened. He despaired in that way so that he would learn not to rely upon himself, but upon the God who raises the dead. And what I have experienced in my struggles with doubt over the years is that God is faithful to raise the dead, to take me out of the dungeon of despair as I doubted. And that's what this book really is about. So I share some very personal stories in here, but what I'm seeking to do is to bring the theology of the Scriptures and the theology of a triune God, a Father who loves us in and through Jesus Christ by the Holy Spirit, to bring that to bear upon my own experience growing up and into my early 20s and early 30s, to show how God is faithful to lead us through those times in marvelous ways that you wouldn't dream for yourself, but you're grateful for the grace of God. So this book would really help someone who is struggling with doubt, assurance. It would help with someone who wants to help others who struggle with that. But I also think it would be an encouragement to someone who doesn't struggle with doubt, because my aim in every chapter is to declare the rich grace of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the talks.
All right, great. Our intention was that everyone who wanted a copy could get one. There's some around the tables, and if you're here with a spouse and you both want one because you don't like each other, you're welcome to both take one. Or if you share nicely, then you can take one together as a group. So I think that's all the things that I wanted to say. I'm going to pray for Jamie, and then, like I said, if you have questions as Jamie is moving through, please don't hesitate to text me those, okay? God, we do bow, giving you thanks for even that testimony of your grace in lifting us out of places of despair. And we pray that these hours that we'll spend together would have that good effect in our lives, that we would see clearly this topic and be able to assess our own hearts and souls and be able to consider the beauty of the gospel as it's applied to our own doubts, and that you would bring clarity and help to us, to our own lives, and then as we seek to help others. We ask that for Christ's sake. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Pastor Matt, for having me. My name is Jamie Dew. I'm the president of New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary down in New Orleans. We have a booth back in the back. If there's anything we can do to help you, we would be glad to do that. It's my lovely wife, Tara. She'll be with you tomorrow. And I'm really excited to be here with you tonight to talk to you and begin dissecting this topic of doubt. Certainly an uncomfortable topic in many ways, but I got to admit, it's not like Song of Solomon, I got to say. He said that, and I thought, whoa, that is not what I came here to do. But yeah, that sounds like a fun time. So go. I'm glad you're doing it, and I hope you're all blessed by it. You know, what I want to do essentially. These are tonight and tomorrow morning are not sermons. I'm going to be with you. I got the good fortune of being with you all weekend long. I'll have an opportunity on Sunday morning to open the scriptures, exegete a text, to preach. Tonight and tomorrow are going to be more talks on the topic, and then of course I do welcome your questions about this. I mean, this is what I've really in a large part spent my entire professional career doing. I've been a Christian for almost 30 years. I have been in the field of apologetics and Christian philosophy for 25 of those years at least, and there's a very real sense in which everything I have ever done academically originated out of my own struggles with doubt. And so I want to tell you a little bit about that story, but the main thing I want us to try to do together tonight is try to dissect doubt, and then try to think in a constructive way about how we deal with it. Because if I can just be candid, I do not think that the vast majority of efforts we put forward to addressing doubt are actually all that fruitful. I think we misdiagnose what the root of the problems are, and therefore we go about trying to resolve it in unhelpful ways, and people walk away from their faith as a result of that. We don't want to do that. So tonight I want to just try to dissect this. In short, let me kind of go ahead and state one of the punchlines of the evening, and then I'm going to spend every bit of our time together just, again, trying to dissect this and exegete this thing that happens in our minds called doubt. In short, here's what happens. We start having doubts, and we immediately sense and feel, we feel this immense pressure that there's something wrong either with me personally, or there's something wrong with the Bible, or there's something wrong with Christianity, or there's something wrong with Jesus, and therefore we freak out. As if Christians are the only ones that have questions. I think a lot of times we think that, and we assume that, oh, well, I have doubt about what I believe, and that's something that's only possible for Christians to have. But you know, atheists could never have doubts about their things. Scientists could never have doubts about their things. Historians could never. Christians, this is unique to Christianity. Now, let me just go ahead and say this as clearly and firmly as I can. No, there's nothing actually distinct, that this is a distinctly Christian problem. It's just not. This is, in large part, what I want to say to us tonight is, hey, this is kind of what it means to be a human being. No matter what you believe, no matter what perspective you're coming out of, you do not have the absolute certainty about a lot of the things that you want to have, and that's just part of the human condition. And so once I realized that, I'll tell you my story here in just a second. Once I began to realize that, I thought to myself, oh, okay, well then no big deal. And I moved on, and I had a whole lot more peace about this whole situation that I was struggling with so deeply. I got 10 things to talk about tonight about the causes of doubt. Let me go ahead and give you the framework, now let's tell you my story real quick. Tonight we are going to focus on what I'm calling the causes of doubt. Because again, I think that a lot of time we think, well, the reason I have doubt about this is because there's something wrong with Christianity. No. There's actually a multitude of causes that contribute to a person struggling with their faith. And I want to talk about those things tonight, the causes of doubt. Tomorrow, we'll come back and we'll deal with how do you handle doubt. I mean, to some degree or another, recognizing that I've got a big pool of people here. I've got some people in this room that probably have struggled or are struggling deeply at this very moment with their faith. And it's like on a scale of 1 to 10, it's like a 9.5. And then I probably got other people in the room that, just never really struggled with it. To which I say, God bless you, go in peace. You still need to learn how to help people that deal with this type of thing. For the most part, all of us, at some point or another, have questions. We don't really know how to resolve them, and that can, in fact, create a bit of an existential and theological crisis as we go through those things. And that's what I want to try to do. I want to talk about why this happens tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about what to do about it. And then on Sunday, I'm going to preach from Matthew chapter 11. We're going to take a look at John the Baptist, greatest person ever born of a woman. And yet he has a very intense struggle with doubt over whether or not Jesus is the Christ. So we'll talk about that on Sunday morning, give you sort of a biblical case study is what we're going to do. That's the agenda. That's the table of contents. Make sense? You good with me? All right, let me tell you my story real quick. How did I get up here? Not intentionally. I grew up, I failed 2 grades because I couldn't read, 2nd grade and 3rd grade. I graduated high school with a 1.6 GPA. I got arrested twice my junior year in high school for stealing 7 cases of beer out of the back of a grocery store and smoking pot one night in my Jeep as I was riding around. And came to faith at the age of 18 years old, June 16th, 1995. Out of deep brokenness, deep despair, I was a broken, shattered kid. And parents had split up when I was a little boy. All kinds of things had gone on. I'd gotten into all kinds of trouble. And in deep, deep despair, God rescued me out of this. June 16th, 1995, I hear the gospel. I'd heard the gospel many times. But on that night, God gave me eyes to see and ears to hear. And I threw myself onto Jesus Christ. And I knew that I was home in Christ. And I knew that I was going to spend the rest of my life doing this. And so here we are, 30 years later. I fell passionately in love with Jesus. And all I wanted to do was proclaim him, which meant I was reading this book constantly. I wanted to share the gospel with people. I was a walking machine gun of evangelism. Just, man, if you could fog a mirror, I was sharing the gospel with you. And I remember my sophomore year in college in particular, I was the RA in a dorm. By this point, God had done some pretty significant work to rejuvenate my grades and get me into a college, and some cool things were starting to happen. Most of it just simply because I had this burning passion to know, like I'd never had before, and academics was actually beginning to be a thing for me, to my great surprise. And I can remember it was my goal. I went to a little college in North Carolina called Lewisburg College, formerly a Methodist college, junior college. Only about 500 people on the campus. Then you had faculty, staff, administrators, and it was my goal that year to share the gospel with every single person on that campus. I didn't get that far, but I did get as far as sharing the gospel with probably 80-90% of them. Saw lots of people come to faith, and I was just sharing my faith. And I can remember there was this one guy on my hall who claimed to be a Taoist. It's an Eastern religion. It's kind of atheistic at its core. And I can remember every time, his name was Mark, and every time I would share the gospel with Mark, he would raise these, and he was a very sharp academic student where I was the dummy, that had failed the grades and everything. And so Mark, every time I'd share the gospel with him, Mark would start throwing out these fairly substantial objections. Sometimes it was to the existence of God. Sometimes it was to the possibility of miracles. Sometimes it was the problem of evil. It was just all sorts of things. And man, I knew the Bible by this point backwards and forwards. They used to call me the walking Bible because I was just consuming the scripture, and I could give him a biblical answer. And I remember Mark, every time I'd pop him with some scripture in response, I can remember Mark would say to me these simple words: yes, but that's the Bible, and I don't believe the Bible, so why should I believe any of this? And, if we were having a biblical conversation, a theological conversation, I was quite comfortable. But the moment he took that out of play, and I had to answer on just objective bases, I had no idea what to say. And here I was trying to share my faith with people, and I was ill-equipped to respond. And I got to tell you, because I love Jesus so passionately, that bothered me deeply. It bothered me deeply that I could not answer these questions and that I could not defend my precious Lord. I discovered a discipline called apologetics. Some of you know what apologetics is. Some of you maybe don't. We're not apologizing for anything when we do apologetics. We are simply defending the faith. The Greek term there in 1 Peter 3:15 is to be ready to give a defense. It's A legal picture is what a lawyer does, a defense lawyer, when he's defending his client. The client is accused of something, and the defense lawyer stands up and gives a defense against it. Christianity under attack, and it is our job. It's a calling placed on Christians. I don't know that I necessarily want to say every single Christian has to be able to do this, but the body of Christ better have people in it that can do this, who defend the faith. You don't believe in God? Here's the evidence. You don't believe in the possibility of miracles? Here's the evidence. You think the problem of evil dissuades us from God? Here's counter arguments and all those things. And so guys like me, this is what we do. We write books and we respond to these big evidential things. And so often running I was, right? Sophomore year in college, I went to Sequoia Falls College, took courses in apologetics, fell in love with it. And by the time I got to Southeastern Seminary in the year 2000, I was seeking to take every philosophy course and every apologetics course that I could possibly get my hands on, every New Testament and Old Testament background course, anything that would help me defend the faith. I was passionate about it, but something else was beginning to happen in my heart. I have gone through in my 30 years of knowing the Lord, I have gone through two pretty substantial, dark seasons of personal doubt and struggle with my faith. I've always been the kind of person, still am to this day, who sits around and wonders about this or that or the other. Like, we believe this and we believe that. Those don't seem to go together. How could you do this? But they don't freak me out anymore. I'll just say that. But two pretty substantial seasons of doubt and struggle with my faith. And when I say seasons of doubt and struggle, I'm talking about, at certain points, intense enough that despite the fact that I was pastoring a church at one of these seasons, I was actually deeply afraid that I was about to completely abandon my faith and hurt people, hurt my wife, hurt the church, the people that I loved. I mean, just deep, deep, deep seasons of doubt over all of this. The first time I was coming out of college and into seminary, struggled with it most of seminary. This is what led me to do a first PhD. I did a PhD after seminary at Southeastern Seminary. I went on to do a PhD there in theological studies with a focus on philosophy of religion. The first season of doubt and struggle came from me struggling with the big question. And I was beginning to realize in all of this that for me, while apologetics spans all of the disciplines, history and science and cultural things, for me it was the big philosophical questions that bothered me, and that's how I became a philosopher. I did a PhD in theological studies with a focus on philosophy of religion. I was interested in and I was passionate about chasing the question of God's existence. It was that big question. It just hit me one day. I was beginning to struggle. It was no longer Mark's question. It was now my question. For me, it hit me one day like a ton of bricks. It was like I'd run into a wall. A guy like me had done more than just simply believe this stuff. I had thrown my entire existence upon him. My entire education, everything I had, all it was to serve him. And yet I'd never seen him. I'd never touched him. I'd never smelled him. I'd never tasted him. I'd never heard him. I didn't have access to God in the same way that I have access to you. And that began to bother me. Is he really there? Is there really such a thing as God? So it was that big question of the existence of God that took me into what this thing called natural theology, where we make arguments for God's existence, cosmological arguments, teleological arguments. And maybe you came to a doubt conference expecting tonight that I was going to do that. I am not. There's a time and a place for it, but I don't want to do that here. I don't think that's the most helpful thing I can do with you. I spent my whole career academically doing that kind of thing. Apologetics, PhD, led me into this field called religious epistemology, the relationship of science and theology, and did a PhD on that. And that season of doubt and struggle really resolved itself kind of on its own. By this point, I'm pastoring a church in Wake Forest, North Carolina. It was a rural church. It was an older church, a lot of blue hair when I got there. About 80 older senior citizens at the church. I did 60 funerals in 8 years. I was around death constantly. Not all old people dying of cancer. It was some young folks in there. There were some young ladies with breast cancer. There were some moms. There were some dads. There were some unexpected deaths. There were little children that died. And I was around death all the time. And questions about life after death began to occur to me. I mean, we just, kind of like God, we just take it for granted that he's there. And I doubted that and struggled with that the first time. Now, all of a sudden, I was having questions about this thing. Do we actually survive our death? I mean, you can meet almost anybody in this world, not just Christians. Even non-Christians believe, oh yeah, we're all going to live forever in some afterlife. And yet you've never seen somebody come back from the dead. And that kind of question was beginning to bother me. And so there was a second deep season of doubt and struggle, specifically this time, not about the existence of God, but about whether or not we actually survive our death. This led me to do a second PhD, University of Birmingham in England. And I focused in the area called philosophy of mind, defending the existence of an immaterial soul, a non-physical soul, and things of that nature, and getting into mind-body questions and the metaphysics of all that type of stuff. And so I've spent my entire career doing the highest level of academics that I could possibly do, chasing doubt. A very unique thing happened to me. 2017, I woke up one morning to go to the bathroom, and I'll spare you all the gory details. But I went to the bathroom, and all of a sudden I was hemorrhaging. An artery in my large intestine just randomly burst. No pain, no warning, never had any blood before, and I am pouring blood. I pass out in the bathroom. I wake up on a stretcher on my way to the hospital, in and out of the hospital over the next few days. I'd had a random intermittent bleed in my large intestine. My doctors later told me that I was fortunate that my bleed was intermittent, because most of the time that particular kind of bleed is non-intermittent. It just starts bleeding and it doesn't stop, and I'd have been dead in 3 minutes. I had 15 inches of my large intestine removed. I almost died twice in that whole process. And both of those times I was actually acutely aware and conscious of the fact that I was about to die. I don't share this type of story a lot, but since we're talking about doubt, and I need to tell you my story, because actually there's some reflections that I want to talk about tonight from all this. I don't know how else to say it to you, my friends. There in those moments, I had become a bit of a hypochondriac, scared to death of my death, wondering about life after death, wondering about my small children. If I were to die, would they remember my name, or would I just be some picture at their wedding? And I leaned over and I said to my wife, make sure that the kids know that I love them, because I thought I was going. In that moment, I don't know how else to say it other than I sensed the most intense sense of Jesus' presence with me in that moment. And to my shock and to my surprise, I was not afraid. There was overwhelming peace. There was joy. There was this deep sense that it's going to be okay. I will be okay. She will be okay. They, my kids, will be okay. And it forever changed me. What I had not been able to do, listen to me, this is important for my reflections tonight. What I had not been able to do in 20 plus years of the most intense academic work that I could possibly do, trying to resolve doubt, Jesus showed up in my life in about 30 seconds and did it forever. Which makes a guy like me look back on all this academic stuff I have done and go, could doubt be more than just an intellectual problem? Could doubt be something bigger, much more complicated, much more complex than just merely an academic problem? And of course, I'm standing here tonight because I think that it is. In short, I spent my life trying to resolve doubt. And so along the way, there's lots of things to talk about now and reflect upon about what's actually going on in these moments. What's actually triggering these existential crises that we have of belief. And so let me just jump into this list tonight and share with you, I think, at least these 10 things, probably more things. But my friends, if we treat doubt as merely an intellectual problem, I think we might just be chasing the wrong problem. Now, I'm going to say tonight, intellectual problems are a problem. So we will have to take them seriously, but we cannot reduce doubt to just that. Okay, so 10 things tonight. Number one of the biggest things that causes doubt is what I would call unmet expectations of certainty. I'm a Christian, I believe these things, and I'm supposed to be certain. And we will sing like we do. And in church environments, we will talk like we do. And maybe those of you who teach the Bible or preach the Bible will preach and teach like you do. But then, in the dark moments of night when we can't sleep, when our head rests upon the pillow, questions and wonders begin to occur to us. And in those moments, maybe in ways that you're not quite comfortable saying to other people, you sit there with questions. You sit there with uncertainty, and that in itself creates a crisis. I talked about this just a few minutes ago at the very beginning. Hey, I'm supposed to have absolute certainty about these things, but the truth of the matter of it is you don't, or at least not always. And the fact that you don't have that kind of absolute certainty from time to time, or ever, we take from that there must therefore be some problem unique to Christianity. And we tend to think that it's only the Christian or only Christian belief that could be subject to uncertainty. And part of what I want to say here tonight is that no, that is not the case at all. This is, as I said earlier, this is just what it is to be human. It is not unique to Christianity. A Muslim that's intellectually honest would have these same things. A Hindu who's intellectually honest would have these things. A scientist who's intellectually honest would have these things. It doesn't really matter what your belief system, worldview, or meta-narrative actually is that you operate from. My friends, this is a human problem. It is not a distinctly Christian problem. And again, the moment that I sort of realized this was that first PhD. This is what drove me into the field called epistemology. Epistemology is the field of philosophy that deals with knowledge questions. How do I know? Can I have certainty? What does it mean what is truth exactly? Those types of questions. That's what drove me into all that. And the more I got into that, it wasn't any particular discovery of some epistemic fact that resolved my doubt. It was just merely the discovery that human beings have questions sometimes. So think about it, what it means to be human and the condition that a human being finds themselves in, okay? So number one, you're finite. Finite, what does that mean? It means that you have limitations. I can wish to jump to the moon, but I can't do it. I can barely get maybe 12 inches off the ground at this point in my life. And with a hurt knee, I might not be able to get 6 inches off the ground. I have limitations, but my limitations are not merely physical. I also have cognitive, intellectual limitations. You could be an absolute genius, scientifically or mathematically, and yet the truth of the matter of it is you have limitations in your cognitive faculties, and you will not be able to wrap your head around the whole thing. We are finite creatures trying to wrap our heads around an infinite being. And so I'd ask you this question: how successful are we going to be with that? I think we'll be successful enough that we can actually know him, know true things about him, things that we can base our life upon. But at the end of the day, finite creature, don't be so arrogant to expect that you will ever fully comprehend the infinite God. We sometimes say things about heaven like, when I get to heaven, I'm going to understand everything. No, you will not. Because forever and ever and ever and ever in heaven, you will continue to be a finite creature, no matter what. You don't transform from being a finite creature to an infinite creature, because that would mean that the human becomes God himself. And that will not happen. For all of eternity, we will be finite, which means for all of eternity, we will continue to learn and learn and learn, because we are contemplating an infinite being. Part of the reason you and I don't have the absolute certainty that we want to have sometimes is because we're finite creatures trying to wrap our heads around an infinite being. And therefore your knowledge, listen to me, your knowledge and your ability to apprehend will always and only ever be partial. Another reason that humans have this problem is not just because they're finite, but because they're fallen. And I'm not trying to alliterate here, but we have to think about this. Genesis chapter 3 happened, you know. And go back through. I want to challenge you tonight in Genesis chapter 3. As you go back through it tonight, I want you to watch how irrational Adam all of a sudden becomes, and Eve even all of a sudden becomes. They've just been walking with God in the garden. And in Genesis chapter 3, when Eve takes the fruit, gives to Adam, and he eats it, nature itself is bent. Thorns and thistles will now spring up from the ground. Rocks will groan, according to Romans chapter 7. Rocks will groan. Every single aspect of the created order is now bent and twisted, including our minds. And that explains a lot about the text right there, doesn't it? Notice how irrational Adam becomes. The woman that you gave me, how dare you blame God? Eve now will begin to have moments of doubt in these moments. You and I are not just finite, we're also fallen. We have sin. I'll talk a little bit more about sin later. Sin is in our lives, and that messes up the cognitive effects that we have. And these are some of the causes of doubt. So one of the things I just want to underscore right out of the gate, one of the things that sometimes drives our doubt is that I am expecting to have a certainty, and I don't yet have it. And I'm telling you, you don't have it for these reasons. not because there's something wrong with Christianity. Every human, every belief system, every meta-narrative will have people in it that sit there, if they're intellectually honest at least, and they'll say, yeah, I'm not sure about this, that, or the other. That's just part of what it means to be human. Second, here's a big one. Unmet life expectations. Man, my life is not going the way I thought it was going to go. I've prayed. I've tried to be faithful. I go to church regularly even. Man, for that matter, I even serve. And as I serve, I'm just trying to be a faithful servant. I'm trying to live for Jesus. But my career is in shambles. My relationship with somebody is in shambles. Maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's your child, maybe it's your parent, maybe it's your brother or sister, maybe it's your neighbor. Something is not going right in my life. And simply put, given that I'm trying to be faithful to Jesus, I expected it to be different. We might not even be able to consciously express it this way. But subconsciously, underneath all of these things happening, this is causing me to struggle with my faith because I expect God to show up in my life in a very particular way. Number one, just because of this mental picture I have of God, but number two, especially given the fact that I'm living a certain way. And one of the things I'm going to say to you Sunday morning, as we look at the life of John the Baptist, is that God most often does not show up in your life the way you expect him to. And he most often does show up in your life in the way that you weren't looking for him to. And one of the things that you and I have to do here, my friends, is you and I have to learn how to realign our expectations of God to match the promises of God. Simply put, a lot of times we get frustrated with God. Sometimes we find it hard to believe and hang on to belief in God because God is not doing for us what we thought he should do. And my question to you is simply this: did he promise you he'd do any of those things? Probably not. And we ought to therefore be looking for not what we wanted him to do or expect him to do, but what he told us he was actually going to do. And let our proof be there. So unmet expectations, a big cause of people losing faith, walking away. What I don't want to do here tonight is approach this like just a lecture. I actually want to pause here in some of these moments and just kind of ask you this question. Is that going on in your life right now? I mean, maybe you have struggled or are struggling with belief in God, and I just ask, is this one of the things that's going on? You expected this, and that did not happen? We're going to see this with John the Baptist on Sunday. Is God doing something much different in your life? That's a cause. Number 3, unmet spiritual expectations. Let me tell you the particular group of people that often experience this. Young adults around the age of, say, 20 to 25 years old, this window of time, this happens a lot, especially if they grew up in the church. Here's why. They grew up in the church. They did the D-Nows. They did the youth camps. They had these very rich, emotional experiences with God in corporate worship. They even sensed God calling them or doing something in their life unique like that. And then what happens is, as we grow up, especially in the case of a male in particular, a male brain's not fully developed till about the age of 25 years old, which means chemically and cognitively, that individual is going to continue changing all the way up to that point. And all of a sudden, the equilibrium settles and adjusts the way it's going to be into male adulthood. And they don't feel about things quite the same way that they used to. And they used to have these rich, intense feelings about God, and they struggle to have them at all anymore. My own children struggle with this. In the last 2 months, probably 2 of my 4 children have come to me at some point, almost always, after we've said our family prayers. It's supposed to be bedtime. You're supposed to be off in your bed, sleeping your little heart out and stuff. But no. I hear, come in. Dad, can I talk to you? And they'll come in, they'll sit on the foot of our bed, and Tara will sit there, and they'll just kind of open up. And, Dad, can I ask you a question? Sure. Like, I've been reading my Bible, and I try to do my devotion so faithfully. doing those devotions and praying his prayers and all those things. Dad, I don't know. I feels like, he doesn't quite say it this way, but what he's saying is it feels like my prayers are bouncing off the ceiling, and I've had these moments when I could tell God was close. And that's not happening right now. And what they begin to sense and feel is that something's wrong with me, or worse, something is wrong with Christianity itself. There's a lot of people that struggle with their faith because of an expectation of a certain type of spiritual experience. We kind of sometimes have it in our head that if I'm walking with God and being faithful, I'm always going to sense him being nearby. I'm always going to have these feelings when we sing or in corporate worship. I'm always going to sense him in my prayer life. Show me one place in the Bible that God ever promised that. He didn't. He didn't. And therefore, we have to learn how to check the expectation of our spiritual life, right? And learn to look. We'll talk a lot more about that type of thing tomorrow morning. But because of a certain kind of feeling, lack of feelings, maybe it's a lack of progress in a sin struggle. I have this particular, let's just call it a soft spot spiritually in my life. A certain sin propensity. Maybe it's lust. Maybe it's greed. Maybe it's anger. And I pray, and I pray, and I pray, and doggone it, I pray. And there I am again tomorrow. And no matter how hard I pray, no matter how fervent I am, God just seems to let me dangle and struggle. And no matter what, it seems like God's not meeting me in that moment. I'm not making that progress that I would have expected to make. Maybe it's just some unmet spiritual expectation. Triggers a season of doubt, an existential crisis, and a wonder, is this actually true? My friend, I'll just simply say this. Throughout the Psalms, you're not the only one to ever feel that. If I'm describing you right now, I'll just say to you, you're not the only one that ever felt that way. Throughout the Psalms, the psalmist will ask questions like, how long, God? How long will you let me wait? How long will you let the enemy triumph over me and let me just lay here and struggle? How long, O Lord? Sometimes for our spiritual good, God seems to extract himself from our moment, to produce in us certain longings, to produce in us certain consistencies. But in those moments, it can be a deep cause of doubt and struggle, an unmet spiritual expectation. Fourth, I probably should do these 4 and 5 together, but fourth, physical fatigue. I heard that kind of thing when I was a younger man, and I thought that was the dumbest thing I had ever heard of. You mean to tell me being tired, being worn out, is going to cause me to have certain spiritual realities? I just never believed that. And then you know what happens, right? You get older and you grow up, and sure enough, when I look back through my life, some of the moments that I have the most intense frustration in my faith, some of the most intense maybe moments of doubt and struggle, normally it is when I am completely and totally worn out. Maybe I'm not taking care of myself physically in the way that I should. My friends, that might not make a lot of sense to you. But let me just say this. I spent my whole life chasing these types of things. Here's what I think you are and what I am. I don't think you're a ghost in a machine. Meaning, I don't think that you're just a spirit inside a body and that your body has nothing to do with what or who you are. No, it seems to be what the Christian faith actually taught for about 1,100 years, most consistently, and still continues to teach to this day through many of the traditions, is that you are a composite of the body soul together. That you are a spirit and a body in union. And if that's the case, that explains a lot about things like, crack me across the head with a frying pan. And it does more than just simply change my cognitive states. It actually can change me, right? People with brain damage and things of this nature, it can forever change who they are and what they are because of this right here. And if that's true, then when this is not right, this is not right. So physical fatigue is a major, major problem of this. Spiritual fatigue. As a young man, I've been preaching now for, right at 30 years, I guess. I've preached thousands of times. As a young man, when I would preach, I remember probably the first 15 years, it took me 15 years to figure this out. For 15 years, every single time I'd preach, here's what would go down. I would study, I would prepare, praying my little heart out the whole time I'm studying and preparing and doing all these things, pouring myself into it, nauseous the whole time about the thought of standing up in front of all these people. Saturday, lunchtime, my stomach would erupt because of the stress. And it would stay that way all the way through Sunday evening when I was done. Preach Sunday morning, Sunday night. Get up there and pour my heart out and preach. And here's what I noticed. Even when those moments, especially in those moments, when the sermon and the preaching would go really, really, really well, I mean, it's like I'm pouring myself out. God seems to be moving, speaking in profound ways every single time. Every single time. That afternoon comes along, and by the time I get home, I don't know how else to explain it to you other than just depression. A sense of melancholy. My soul was blue. It made no sense to me. I just quite literally stepped off this mountaintop experience with God where the Holy Spirit, I could sense him. He's with me in this moment, and I'm watching God do things in people's lives as I'm preaching the gospel to them. What a great ride. What an honor. What a privilege. What a blessing. What fun. What joy. And now, just 30 minutes later, depression. What in the world? For 15 years, the first half of my ministry, I wondered about that. And then one day it hit me. Well, duh. I just poured myself out. And now I'm empty. And I've learned not just the physical fatigue, but the spiritual fatigue of serving the Lord faithfully and pouring yourself out does something, a cumulative effect on your heart and on your soul, causing me at times to doubt, causing me to struggle, causing me to wrestle with whether or not this is actually true. And I've learned about myself, I'm a simple creature. Give me a little bit of time with the Lord, give me a little bit of time with Tara, give me a good night's sleep, and I'm ready to roll the next day. But it took me a while to figure that out. These things, spiritual fatigue, can actually cause you to doubt and struggle. Remember Elijah? Remember staring down the prophets of Baal? But now in a moment of deep spiritual fatigue, he fails miserably because of spiritual fatigue, right? So this is a cause of this. Number 6, stress and anxiety, similar to all those. Your life can be in shambles. Your marriage can be at a moment of peak stress. Your children may be dysfunctional, or you may be at odds with them in some deep way. Maybe it's your job. Things are not going well. Maybe it's your finances, you're broke, you got problems coming at you, and you don't know what you're going to do. Real life stress and anxiety is a doubt inducer. It's the kind of thing that when you're going through it, people often have deep trouble hanging on to God in these moments. So number 6, stress and anxiety. Number 7, an obvious one, suffering and pain. Isn't it ironic that in moments of severe suffering, encounters with evil, these are the moments where we actually need God the most. And yet, the irony of it is, this is exactly how the devil would twist it. In these moments where we need God the most, these happen to be the moments that we often struggle the hardest to hang on to belief in God. Every worldview, every meta-narrative. I've said that word a couple times. Let me explain that word. Meta-narrative, meta, overarching narrative, story. A story that is an overarching explanation of reality. Christianity is one of these. Christianity attempts to explain all of life and all of reality and all of creation, and everything that is accounted for by Christianity. Christianity is this thing called a meta-narrative. Every meta-narrative. Naturalism and atheism is a meta-narrative, right? All the religions of the world are meta-narratives. Every worldview or meta-narrative has something that it struggles to explain. And for Christianity, if we're honest, through most of our history, 2,000 years now, the perennial problem is the problem of evil. It's the problem that given the nature of God, if God is all good, and if God is all powerful, then it just seems as though we wouldn't expect evil and suffering. Because, well, as David Hume, the famous atheist, put it, if God is all good, he would eliminate the evil. And if God is all powerful, he could eliminate the evil. So if God is all powerful and all good, he would and could eliminate the evil. There should be no evil, and yet we watch the news. We look into our mirrors and we see it in ourselves. We see things happen around the world. Evil is everywhere, right? And that just doesn't seem to be right. Given our theism, we wouldn't have expected this evil and suffering to be there. And atheists have, throughout the entire history of Christianity, they've made big hay over this thing called the problem of evil. They've given us this thing called the logical problem of evil, and the evidential problem of evil, and the existential problem of evil. These are all different iterations of arguments against the very belief that we have that there is a God in heaven who is good and powerful. And the atheists don't believe because of this problem. I think if we're honest, we'd have to say that it's not just the atheist who struggles sometimes with belief in God because of evil. I was pastoring that little church I was telling you about, those 60 funerals. Yeah, some of them were elderly people. Some of them were people that had fought cancer for 10 years. And I remember one particular season, as a pastor, pray for your pastor. I've had worse stresses. Now, being a pastor is glorious and wonderful. But there is a very unique kind of stress that a pastor lives with constantly. I don't know how else to explain it to you, other than just pray for him. Even if it's a great church like this one, just pray for your pastor. Some aspects of this are just stressful. Like death in particular, the funerals that I constantly had to do, I don't know how else to say it other than they begin to have a cumulative effect on your soul. And I subscribe to the idea that when I walk into that home with a family that just lost someone, I should weep with those who weep. And I should rejoice with those who rejoice. And so what that meant is often as I was walking into those homes, into absolute brokenness and devastation, real pain, real sorrow. And you have to be emotionally chameleon in these moments. You have to kind of absorb the feel of the room. If they're holding it together as a pastor, you walk into a room in a moment of death and they're holding it together, don't you dare fall apart. But at the same time, as a pastor, you walk into that room and they're falling apart, don't you dare go in there and say, it's going to be okay. Absorb the grief. Weep with them in those moments. And you do that again and again and again and again, and it just begins to have this effect. And I remember I'd gone through quite a season of all of this, and there was one young lady who had fought cancer, breast cancer. She was beautiful. And she was kind, and she was joyful, and she loved the Lord. She'd come to faith in Christ through her cancer, and her mom and her dad, elderly, had joined the church. And her cancer was back, and this time it had attacked her central nervous system, and it was absolutely crushing her. And as a church, we prayed for her constantly. And it seemed as though no matter how hard we prayed, her suffering would intensify. Until eventually she perished. I did her funeral. The week I did her funeral, we as a church got the devastating news that a 2-year-old boy in our church had just been diagnosed with a neuroblastoma, a brain cancer. Tried surgeries, chemo, radiation for 10 months. We prayed and we prayed and we prayed and we prayed. I felt like a broken record. And no matter how much we prayed, he suffered more and more and more. And one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, not just in my ministry, but my life, was stand there over a little casket of this boy. Hundreds and hundreds of people, his doctors coming out. I pastored one of those churches that was a small rural church, which meant there were actually like 4 churches that were networked together. And if you were pastor one of them, you kind of pastored all of them. And I can remember he died on a Monday. We did his funeral on a Friday. And I never, ever, ever, ever feel like in a funeral, especially, or in an actual moment of grief, when families are struggling, I never feel like I should, even though I've got the training to walk into those moments. It's not my place to walk in and be the apologist or to be the theologian, to be a scholar. What they need in that moment is not a scholar. They need a pastor whose heart will break with them and stand with them and grieve with them. And I can remember from Monday to Friday, if one person said this to me, I bet you I had 12 people that week. Some of them were members of my church. Some of them were members of other churches in the neighborhood. And I can remember just person after person after person would come to me and just say, Jamie, I don't know. I don't know. And I knew what they meant by this. We've prayed and we prayed and we prayed, and yet nothing we prayed worked. It's ironic, isn't it? In the moment that we need God the most, we actually find it the absolute hardest to hang on to him often in those moments, right? Sometimes it's pain, sometimes it's suffering. We have to recognize that these are causes of these moments. Number 8, we'll talk about resolving some of these things tomorrow. Number 8, intellectual challenges. So here I am. I'm a philosopher by training. I've done my whole life at doing apologetics. I want to make the point that I'm listing this as like number 8. It's a real problem. We need to have people in the body of Christ that can do this kind of stuff and resolve it and speak to it. But I'm convinced that most of the time this is actually a secondary issue. Sometimes there are real intellectual problems. Yes, it really does happen, though I'm not convinced that the reason, 75%, I hope and pray and trust is not true of your church. Hope and pray and trust is not true of your church. But across the United States, 75% of students in a youth group of a church will abandon their faith when they get to college or shortly thereafter college. I hope and pray and trust is not true of your church, but that's an alarming statistic, and we pay a lot of attention to, like, well, why do they leave? I think we should actually pay attention to why the other 25% stay. Sometimes it's an intellectual problem. We often think that of those 75%, that like 100% of those times, it's because they went to college and some English professor or biology professor or philosophy professor gives them some intellectual bomb and it, deconstructs the whole thing about their faith. That does happen, so much so that we need to register this and talk about it for a moment. But again, I want to press, that's probably not the big cause of it, but this is a factor. It is nevertheless a factor. Sometimes we face new information that we hadn't thought about, we hadn't really had a chance to think it through, and it challenges some aspect of our faith. Maybe it's the problem of evil. Those kinds of arguments that atheists can make against us, those sometimes dislodge faith and make it for a person very difficult for them to hang on to God. Maybe it's something like the successes of modern science. Here's the world. I try not to bore you with all the intellectual historical details of it, but here's sort of an intellectual history since the Enlightenment. 17th century, the Western world turns in a unique way. You've had 1,700 years of what we call the Judeo-Christian era, where Christianity answered all the questions of society. You want to know about truth? Bible. You want to know where it comes from? God. You want to know what it's for? God. Christianity was the answer. It was the meta-narrative. In the 17th century, everything turns. It's called the age of science and reason. You have the birth of the two most dominant forces in the modern world, modern philosophy and modern science. René Descartes locks himself into an oven of sorts and launches modern philosophy in this movement called rationalism, which is going to say that the only basis of knowing anything, even religious things, is reason. In that same century, actually about 10, 15 years before this, Francis Bacon wrote a little book called the Novum Organum. It was in response to one of Aristotle's works called Organum, which means method. Aristotle had argued for a deductive method for natural science. We should do science deductively. It doesn't work. Which explains why for thousands of years, horse and buggy and candles, no real scientific progress, because that methodology doesn't work. Well, Bacon's Novum Organum, new method, does work. It's a method of what we call induction, and from that, this thing called the scientific method is born. And watch this. Within a couple hundred years, after thousands of years of horse and buggy and candles, within a couple hundred years, we're putting people on the moon. We open people's chests, we take their heart out, we put a new one in, we rewire it, crank them back up, and off they go for another 20-some years. That's amazing. What happened? A new method. It was the age of science now. And watch this. In this age, the answers come not from your religious ideas, but from science and reason. It's the age of science and reason. And you know what? We may bicker about that, but most of us take Advil. Blood pressure medicines. We have cell phones. We ride in airplanes. I did today. We send emails, and our lives are intertwined with the successes of modern science. And boy, aren't we naturally inclined in our minds to think, well, we can believe certain things over here, but man, if a scientist says it, at least in a pre-COVID world, I never thought I'd see it shift away from this, but then COVID happened. I'm like, holy smokes, it happened. At least into a pre-COVID world, man, if somebody in a white coat said something to you, you took that as truth. Whereas you might just merely take what your preacher says as an opinion, a value, a belief. Beliefs over here, facts over here. That's the world we inherited from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment said to us, if you can't prove what you believe with either empirical data or a philosophical argument, it is useless. And a lot of Christians live that way. We encounter people with robust intellectual ideas, and it shakes us in our faith. We hear somebody say, I'm an atheist and a scientist, and our blood pressure goes up a little bit, right? Intellectual problems, these are real, and they should be thought through. I'll talk tomorrow about how to deal with those types of things. Number 9, I'm going to move quick on these last 2. Sin. I think it is a mistake to treat every person with a doubt or question as if they are choosing to sin against God. Don't do that to people. We're going to see John the Baptist has a real question, and Jesus does not say, come on, you sinner. He actually says, you know what? Of all the people born of a woman, this is the best person ever. He had a question. Don't treat every person that has a doubt as if they're choosing to sin against God. At the same time, it is also a mistake to think that when a person is living with deep doubts and frustrations and all those types of things, it is also a mistake to think that sin's not a problem or part of that as well. I look back on my own seasons of doubt and struggle, and I got to say something to you, man. You know, it wasn't that there was some nasty, big, lurking sin. These were some of the most prideful years of my life. Some of the most arrogant years of my life, of me thinking I was a big shot. Me striving to be something intellectually. And that sin of pride was very real in my life. And it was also a season of deep doubt about all of this. I've had students, many of them. I've taught thousands and thousands of students in my career. Some of the brightest people I've ever met have been students of mine who started off with great promise, great fervency, and some of the darkest things that have ever happened to me as a minister of the gospel is watching some of them completely abandon their faith. All in the name of intellectual questions. Problem is, I know them. And in many of those cases, it wasn't some intellectual philosophical question. It was porn. It was a desire to sleep with his girlfriend, get drunk, smoke pot. Those are powerful things. And they will present themselves as intellectual problems. I'm not saying that every person dealing with doubt is doing that. I'm not. But what I am saying is, again, go back to Genesis chapter 3, the cognitive effects of sin. All of a sudden, Adam and Eve get real irrational. Why? Because sin entered in, right? Sin can jack up your faith. Number 10 and last, friendships. Friendships. Dispositions and opinions are more contagious than COVID. More contagious than the common cold. We absorb dispositions of our friends and our peers. Think about the influence of our friends and our peers on us politically, for example. These are very big decisions that we make when we go to the ballot box. Cast a vote. And often, we have our circle of friends in our ears. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk to each other. But what I am saying is that people have a deep influence on our perspectives. And therefore, paying attention to the people that you're running with, especially if you're struggling with your faith, matters an awful lot. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. Okay, 8:16, 1 minute over. Q&A time, okay?
All right, my number is now on the screen. If you did not have it already, you want to pull up a little bit? I feel like we're
Yeah, that kind of makes more sense.
back there. All right, so we got 25 minutes. All right, so let's run after some questions.
Okay.
Want to spin back to 2017 in your retelling of your story. So I'm going to poke around a little bit with that. You presented that as if that was kind of a definitive moment.
It was.
Do you feel like you'll never doubt again? Like, was there something about that experience that has removed doubt from the Jamie Deuce story for the rest of your life?
Yeah, I don't know what the future holds in my I can speak about that moment from to now. Like, look at the causes I just presented. Well, if I live another 20 years, I could encounter every single one of those with intensity again, and sure, it could produce it again. What I can say is there were two things that really just kind of that were huge in my life and in my heart prior to those moments, and that have been virtually completely gone ever since. I struggled with assurance that this is true, hence the 2 PhDs. And then my hypochondria. I was, every time I'd get a mole in my arm or something, oh my gosh, it's skin cancer, melanoma, I'm gonna die, my kids aren't gonna remember me. It was that kind of thing, and just total, complete paralysis anytime I'd have to have blood drawn. I have a platelet condition called ITP, it always freaked me out, and man, I was just constantly worried about those things. And in that moment where this happened, I was in the ICU. I can remember waking up, I'd passed out, and I was a nurse on this arm, a nurse on that arm. Each of them were starting up IVs so they could just start dumping blood in me. And there was a whole bunch of medical things going on. I can remember saying they had been refusing to go ahead and put the blood in fast because that can actually cause lots and lots of problems. And I can remember the ICU doc just saying, hit him with it, he's young, he can handle it. And so I just started pouring the blood in, it saved my life. And in that moment, and here's the thing, I was too weak to pray for it. So I didn't sense his presence because I started praying for it. I just all of a sudden, the very kindness of God, he shows up in my life in these moments. And I don't walk around since then with that same measure of intensity that he's right here with me. But it almost completely eliminated this season of doubt and struggle, and then also hypochondria. I mean, I went through in December of this year, I tore the meniscus in my knee, got a big blood clot in my leg, and put me in the hospital over Christmas, and my bowel shut down, and that was a pretty scary moment. And I was never afraid. It's the weirdest thing. And I don't know that God's going to do that in everybody's life, but what I share the story simply because it causes me to look back and recognize that, hey man, the reasons I actually believe this stuff have nothing to do with evidence. Or evidence of the particular kind, like empirical evidence or philosophical argument and things like that. Now, that doesn't mean I think that my discipline's no good, but it has completely removed those things since then. I mean, there have been these, I can probably count on one hand the number of times that maybe for like 2 seconds, it hits me like, oh my gosh, I'm going to die one day. But that's just not an occurrence anymore.
Okay. So if I'm a skeptic, there's a sense in which I hear that and it's kind of deflating.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I mean, there's nothing I can do then. You ran some intellectual pursuit that feels like something I can control.
Right.
And then you're just speaking about this like kind of mystical God showed up thing.
Yeah.
Like, is that something that I should seek? Or how does that not just make me completely passive if I'm a doubter?
Great question, because you can't produce those moments. And that's the thing. I don't think you should go around trying to produce those moments. Like I said, I didn't produce that moment. I was too weak to pray for it and hadn't prayed for it before. And it's just all of a sudden the kindness of the Lord shows up. And we don't know what he'll do in one person's life or the next. But I do think there's a sense in which persuasion, we call this cogency. Cogency and persuasion is a person-relative game. Truth is not relative, but what persuades a person is relative. Meaning what persuades me, the things that cause me to believe may not cause you to believe. And the opposite's also true. The things that cause me to doubt and struggle may not cause you to doubt and struggle. It'll be different kinds of things, and so it's different. So what we end up doing from that, especially in a post-Enlightenment world where we have sort of imbibed, if you will, maybe even subconsciously, never knowing we've done it, but sort of imbibed this spirit that, man, philosophical arguments of sorts and scientific data, those are the real things that matter and the real evidence that contributes. And so what we end up doing now is we walk around expecting that God's got to show up in a very particular way in my life. He needs to show me this way and that way. And, when it comes to how God is going to reveal himself to us, who gets to decide how he's going to do that? Me or him? I don't get to dictate to God the terms under which he's going to reveal himself to me. And that's what we often try to do. Well, God, you got to give me one of those experiences. Or God, you got to give me some kind of real rich philosophical argument or some real persuasive scientific thing, and that's going to do it. I don't think we get to dictate to God that way. I think God is the one who decides how he's going to show up and how he's going to reveal. We need to start, therefore, I said this tonight, we have to start aligning our expectations for the things he told us he would be doing. And if all of a sudden we find that he's actually doing the very kinds of things that he said he'd be doing, then we should count that as evidence. So there's this one philosopher named Paul Moser who has critiqued this movement called natural theology. Natural theology is where we try to make these arguments for God's existence, cosmological arguments. These are arguments from the existence of the universe. You know, there's a universe, there has to be a God behind that universe. Teleological arguments, which are design types of arguments, the nature of our blood flow and our clotting of blood and the structure of the eye and things, all those fine-tuned things, there's arguments like that. And one of the things that Moser says is that when in this whole history of modern apologetics, when we've made these arguments, often the skeptic might grant the validity of some of these arguments and yet be completely unpersuaded by them. I studied for my second PhD under a guy named Yujin Nagasawa, dear man, who believes there's a God, but he's completely religious. And I asked him, well, why do you believe there's a God? And it's one of these arguments. So the arguments are enough for him to believe that there's somebody out there, but they're not enough for him to persuade him to some kind of religious life. And that should tell us something. Even if you are the most skillful person in making these arguments, it doesn't mean that the people you're going to talk to are going to now come to your church and get saved. It just doesn't mean that. Right. I think what's happened in this and I know this is sounding very historical and intellectual, but in this post-Enlightenment world, we have stripped out from Christianity all of the things that make it rich for us and meaningful for us, and we've reduced it to just these factual bits. And we were expecting, therefore, these factual bits to carry the full weight of persuasion. When I look back through my life, this is after the post-2017, I'm experiencing, and look, I still love the content of what I do. I'm not saying I think my discipline is stupid. I'm not. I love being a philosopher, and I'm still working on projects. But after that event, it's like I'm looking back now and I'm going, well, my gosh, I spent all this time bad-mouthing religious experience and thinking that that's so subjective, it shouldn't count. But I'm doing sort of this autopsy of my own beliefs. And I'm asking the question, why do I actually believe as a Christian philosopher? And I was surprised by my answers when I got real honest. Here's why I believe. I believe because I think that I've really genuinely encountered Jesus Christ in some way. And multiple times over the last 30 years, maybe it's not him showing up, and walking with me. I've never heard his audible voice, but I have no other explanation for my life other than Jesus Christ. He has shown up in my life in multiple times and ways, and it's changed who I am. That causes me to believe. I think that Christianity explains the world better than anything else. That's kind of a sort of a philosophical reason. Here's another one that I was surprised by. I'm persuaded in corporate worship. Something happens to me in terms of belief it happened tonight. Y'all are singing. I love being on the front row because I can hear all of you behind me. It's like this wave of worship washing over me unto my God. And in those moments, I just believe. I find myself caught up in belief. That does something to me. That's not a philosophical argument. And so now I'm sitting there looking at that going, oh my gosh, my whole career I've mocked that kind of thing. And yet it's actually the very reason that I believe, or one of the very reasons that I believe. It's not only real to me, it's precious to me. And so now I'm coming back to the Enlightenment going, who says that the only kind of evidence that counts is empirical data and philosophical argument? You're telling me transformed lives don't mean anything? It's got to. By the way, the Enlightenment's demand for empirical data, that you have to have empirical data and you have to have philosophical argument. You cannot demonstrate that with empirical data or philosophical argument.
Right.
So
somebody said you're the least weird philosopher and apologist they've met, so that's a good thing. So
thanks. My tribe. Thank you.
I do two questions down that line, though, kind of epistemology questions. You were talking about like our doubts or what makes us human. So one question was like, so if I can't trust my own mind, how can I trust anything? Like how do I? if I can't even trust what's going on in my head? And then a lot of us are teaching the Bible and talking to other people about the Bible.
Right.
So I don't know anything for certain. How can I say anything certainly?
Oh, great question. You know,
Thanks.
so I'm teaching a intro to, my favorite class that I get to teach is not the high-end metaphysics stuff with my master's and PhD students. It's actually intro to philosophy with college students. I love being with them when the light bulb's going on for the first time. My 4 children are in that class with us right now, and I'm getting to teach my kids philosophy, which is super cool. But we've just been talking about these things. We're talking about the nature of perception and the nature of our senses and whether or not our senses are telling us the truth. We could actually demonstrate in a wide variety of ways, auditory and visually in particular, but all the other ways as well. We could actually demonstrate the times, places, and ways in which our senses aren't telling us the truth about what's actually going on in the world. And so you could freak out over that, but I actually think, and this is my response to that question, I actually think it's a far more balanced type of response. Let's just take our senses for a second. While it's true that my senses may deceive me in some way, notice that they still nevertheless are wildly successful in helping me see, understand, and navigate the world that we're in. It is philosophically possible that I'm in the matrix, and this is not real, that this is all just some illusion of my mind. That is a philosophical possibility, but let's just imagine that tonight as I'm talking, someone really took exception with what I said, and they picked up the Pew Bible and they chucked it at me as hard as they could, and it's coming straight from my head. What I would not do in that moment is philosophize. What I would do is I'd duck. Why? It's because our senses are nevertheless, despite the possibility of error, they are nevertheless wildly successful in telling us the truth about what's really going on. So the point here in all that is not to panic or anything. It's to simply have a little bit of what we would call epistemic humility. We're finite creatures. We don't have the ability, given the fact that we're human, to always see perfectly. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the ability to have genuine knowledge, right? So here's an illustration of that statement. And again, let me make the statement, and then I'll give you the illustration of it. While I may not be able to understand everything completely and totally, that doesn't mean that I don't have real knowledge of what I do have. So imagine I'm going to the lake and I'm going to get a scoop of the lake water and drink it. Yuck, but I could drink it. I don't have the capacity to drink that whole lake. I would never have the ability to take that all in. But that doesn't mean that when I drink the lake water, that because I don't understand or take it all in, that doesn't mean that I don't come to a genuine knowledge and a genuine experience of what water is. And our understanding of God is this way. My friends, you are finite, He is infinite. You will only and forever always know partially. Forever, for all of you. I love this, by the way. For all of eternity, I will not know everything. For all of eternity, I will continue to learn. And that learning will induce in me worship. And I'll never be able to fill that cup. I will always thirst and ironically be satisfied in it. But here's the Bible. While I may not be able to understand completely, right? By the way, we have lots of passages in Exodus. The secret things belong to God. But the things that are revealed are for us that we may obey. 1 Corinthians 13, we see through a glass darkly. Meaning we don't grab it perfectly. But that doesn't mean we don't know it genuinely. 1 John chapter 3, it has not yet been revealed what we shall be. I mean, there's a lot about the other side we don't really know. But he goes on to say, but we know that when He is revealed, we shall know Him and be like Him. Right? So the fact that I can't know exhaustively doesn't mean that I don't know genuinely. Does that make sense? And I think in lots of different ways, there's an epistemic humility. I'm a creature. I am forever a creature. And He is forever creator. And I'll wrap my head around Him partially, but never fully. And but I think I'll wrap my head around Him genuinely.
I'm going to maybe read a few questions because they're pretty pointed and I feel like I might mess them up. But the question is generally, I'm beginning to doubt the church's conclusions on, kind of fill in the blank.
Right, okay.
I'm beginning to doubt the church's conclusions on homosexuality.
Okay. Yeah.
how should I think about those kind of doubts like, can I still be a Christian and doubt those issues?
Well, there are certainly cases upon which that you could have a doubt about something taught by your church or something. I mean, there's, after all, denominations, right, that have theological difference, and one person may feel that their particular tradition is not right on this issue and switch. This one in particular, though, there is a lot. I would use this actually as an example of friends, that last point that I made. If I did not have a culture like this culture screaming in my ear constantly on this, wagging its finger in my face on this, pressuring me this way and that way on this, and I were just reading my Bible, I don't think I'd ever draw any conclusion other than God says it's an abomination. And that's, of course, the language of the Old Testament in Leviticus. But it's also reiterated again in the book of Romans as well. One can't simply say that's an Old Testament conclusion. Jesus, fulfills the law and it's no longer applicable. It's upheld again in the book of Romans. And so there's sufficient data, I would say, Old and New Testament, to say that no, this is a biblical principle, that to be a Christian we obey.
Okay, so this question to the cultural narrative spins it the opposite way. Somebody asked, if I were born in a different country with a different dominant religion, do you think I would still be a Christian? So I'm doubting just, this is kind of by virtue of coincidence.
Yeah,
I happen to be born in a place where Christianity is normative.
Yeah, and if you were born in that context, for whoever's asking that question, would you be a Christian? I don't know. Maybe if a missionary came to you and you were persuaded by it, sure. What this question is recognizing is the fact that there are cultural pressures. Kind of, again, to tie into that last question, there are cultural pressures that shape us. Postmodernism has made its living off of recognizing the cultural pressures, these power structures that end up shaping people in different ways. And they do, actually. So I think that this is actually a place where postmodernism gets right. I think what they say we are on the backside of that, though, is completely and totally wrong. But its ability to recognize that cultural pressures and things like that, power structures, end up shaping us and influencing us way, it does. People born in Yemen are Muslim. And people born in Israel are Jewish. And people born in Alabama are, generally speaking, some version of Christian, right? That just is because of cultural pressures. Now, does that mean that the truths of these religions are therefore just culturally relative? No, I don't think so. Does the fact that cultures see things differently, does that mean that they're all on an equal footing? No, I don't think so. This is where, while I've kind of probably at many points tonight sounded like I'm against or not emphasizing strongly enough the academic and the intellectual side of what I've spent the last 30 years of my life doing, here's actually a place where I go, but no, that's why these things come into play here, right? If we're left simply to what one culture says against another, against another, against another, well then, yeah, I guess we'd have to shrug our shoulders and say cultural relativism, but we're not. Truth of the matter of it is, truth statements are tethered to reality in some way. Let me explain. I say to you, those are blue chairs. That's my truth statement. My truth statement is tethered to reality in some way. The chairs turn out to actually be blue, right? You see them, don't you? And the statement lines up with the way the world actually really is. And everything that is has expressible statements about it that turn out to be true or false. So what that means is a kind of relativism that this question or objection wants to ride on doesn't work. Because at the end of the day, truth is not going to be relative because reality is not relative. Reality is fixed in one thing, and it is either, what we say of it is either true or false. And the discipline of apologetics comes in and begins to assess the claims of Christianity to see if they hold up with the way reality actually is. The claims of Islam and whether or not reality is the way it says it is. And I've staked my whole career on saying, no. In the case of Christianity, I said this just a minute ago. The three reasons I believe are, I believe I've encountered him in some way. And then that last one, corporative worship. But second, I think Christianity explains the world better than anything else. The good things and the bad things. I don't think atheism may say, you've got a problem of evil. Okay, atheists, let's get rid of God. Now we got no problem of evil, they say. Actually, they still do, because they can't actually make sense out of their very complaint without the moral terms of Christianity, which means you almost have to presuppose Christianity for that to work. And furthermore, even if I got rid of God, I may not have, if I granted to them that you don't have a problem of evil anymore, they got a worse problem. Now they can't explain anything. As in, like, anything. Why is there a world instead of not? Right? That's big. That's a problem. That's a bigger problem than Christianity's problem of evil. And by the way, we have really good responses to these things. So all that to say, I don't think that some kind of relativism, some kind of cultural relativism where you were born here and that's why you believe, and you're born here and that's why you believe, I don't think that actually works, because reality just is a certain way, and there are truths and falsehoods about those things.
Okay, I want to ask a couple of questions about the causes, and I'm going to get people out. And you feel free to tell me that you're going to talk about this tomorrow, so you don't want to address it tonight, but you were talking about being a hypochondriac. How do we engage with these causal factors without becoming something of a spiritual hypochondriac, something of a like overly introspective of what's going on in our heart? What would be the proper way to kind of tease out, well, what's causing this, and how much thought should I give to that?
No, I don't think that we become spiritual hypochondriacs by doing that. In fact, that's when my son or my daughter come into the room with the knock at night and want to sit and talk and work through these things. This is exactly what I do. One of the first things, so like my youngest son in the last month came to me one night, and there was a little bit of this kind of thing going on, and there was also, in addition to that, just this deep disposition of frustration. He'd just been frustrated, kind of ornery all day long. And he's recognizing this about himself, and he's asking, why do I feel this way? And we just began to do exactly what you're describing. When did you start to feel this way, Samuel? Well, at lunch I was feeling this way, and then right before that chapel I was feeling this way, and I first started to do it after I had a conversation with so-and-so at 8 o'clock this morning. And what we've done is we've gone back to the root of the issue. So I do think when a person is struggling with these things, I think that there's advice we give them. We'll talk about that tomorrow, like rest to give and staying in community and some things like that. There's some don'ts as well. I'll talk about don'ts. Don't do this. Don't handle it this way. Do try these things. So there's some counsel we can give to them, but a large part what we're going to do is we're just going to sit and listen to what's the nature of the concern, what's the nature of the question, and when did you begin to feel this way? And when that happened, why did it make you feel that way? And the more we can unearth what's going on, often we're going to get to some of these non-intellectual questions, but these deeper existential causes of what's going on.
So that's the related question a number of folks ask about, like, how do I think about this in relation to somebody else that's coming to me with doubts? When I don't really do it, do I like tease each of these out? Do I kind of fish around for certain things that I think might be going on? Obviously, the nature of the relationship is going to shape that. If you're doing it with a kid,
Sure.
It's going to be very different than a church member. But how might you use these causes
Sure.
to help other people?
So you may very well fish around, and there's obviously going to be times that you're talking and suggesting some things that are going on, but I would encourage that, in most cases, listen. Spend a lot of time listening and talking to them. Francis Schaeffer, probably the most effective Christian apologist in the 20th century. He's been long with the Lord, but Francis Schaeffer it was said of Francis Schaeffer that if he had 1 hour with a skeptic, he would listen for 55 minutes, and he would speak for maybe 5, of just listening and helping them process. And there's a lot of times with people just giving the ear of letting them process it, that in and of itself has like an antiseptic to the moment and helps them in those ways. I will say, I've been a Christian apologist for my entire career, and because of that, I do have the good fortune of being able to get into conversations with people that maybe your normal layperson wouldn't have. I'm on an airplane and we talk and they find out what I do, and it comes out that they don't believe any of this stuff, and there's that awkward moment in the first 10, 15 minutes of the flight. But normally if we'll just keep talking for a little bit, and normally what I'll do is I'll veer away from all the intellectual questions. I'll just completely change the subject. I want to talk about their life. I want to talk about their family. I want to talk about those types of things. And so let me say this first. People will often say, what do you say to somebody who doesn't believe because of the problem of evil? There is no one-size-fits-all answer. If I talked to 100 people that didn't believe because of evil and suffering, the truth of the matter of it is I would probably need to respond to every single one of them very differently. And I will not know how to respond to them until I've listened to them and heard them out. Here's what I have found. While there have been hundreds of conversations in my ministry and career that I've been able to have with people because I have expertise in these things. In other words, you could talk to me, you can answer these questions, and they start with me. And their grandmother can't do that. Their pastor probably can't even do that. But man, they'll start it with me, and I'll work through some intellectual problems. We'll talk about some of the intellectual things, but I want to try to start talking about their personal life as soon as I can. And what I have found is, after 20, 30, 40 minutes of talking about just life and personal things, all of a sudden we end up coming back over these other things. And I get to hear a side of that complaint that's very personal. And I've learned that most of these people that are hurting, even if it presents as a big intellectual question, most of these people that are hurting don't need an apologist. They need a pastor. They just need somebody to love them and somebody to care for them and listen to them and hear them. And I'm not saying they all come to faith in Jesus, they don't. But it totally and completely changes the dynamic. Real quick, I'll tell the story. When I was in seminary, I worked for 2 attorneys. Neither one of them believed. And I remember one of them, I'm this young, fiery, passionate, studying apologetics guy, and one of them was as liberal as you can be. And the first year I worked with him, he and I love to spar intellectually. We come in, we talk politics, we clash. We talk about religion, we clash. And I began to grow convicted over that because I started to sense that I won't say his name, that he specifically wasn't actually interested in whether or not this was true. He just enjoyed the fight. And that bothered me because I felt like, man, I'm throwing my pearls before swine. He's not listening to me. So I made a covenant before God. I was no longer going to take the bait. If he brought it up, I was going to change the subject. So I go in that week, and he, sure enough, within 15 minutes of being there, he's throwing something at me, and ha, you're funny and everything, and I change the subject. We talk about other things. And I did that kind of thing for about 6 weeks. And I noticed after about 6 weeks, he kind of starts watching me, like, what are you doing? Why are you not doing it? And all I was doing is I just wasn't going to have those delicate conversations in non-teachable moments. I was going to wait on the Lord. And so here's what happened. About a year later, after not doing that at all, changing the dynamic of that relationship, his son had essentially a brain condition. He kept having to get these shunts, and his shunt in his brain clogged, causing massive neurological problems. He was rushed to Duke University Hospital. He was a real estate lawyer. It was in the middle of the refi boom in the early 2000s. We probably that day had 30 real estate closings on the table. We probably had $13 million in our hands at that moment. He couldn't leave to go to his son. And I walked in the office, and I could tell he was disheveled, and he was just, something's wrong. And I said to Paula, Paula, what's going on? She's like, his son. What's going on? Tell me what's going on. I said, okay. I go into the side room, and he's shoveling, trying to stamp this document and that, getting all these documents ready. He's in a total frenzy. And I walked into the room, and I sat down with him, and I said his name. And I said, can I pray with you? And he stops. And all he said is, I really wish you would. And I poured my heart out for his son. The Lord saved his son. And from that moment forward, we had hundreds of really rich spiritual conversations. What he needed was not an apologist. He needed a pastor, someone to love him and show him the love of Jesus. And that changed the dynamic of those conversations completely.
That's great. All right, that seems like a good place to put a pin in it for the evening so the child care people love me. I don't know what I said about the schedule. Something happens at 9 o'clock. Somebody read the card in front of you. What time does the session say it starts? 9:30. All right, the session starts at 9:30 in the morning. There will be a light breakfast served at 9 o'clock. Light means light. So if you do Bojangles like the Jadalas, get it on your way here and not once you arrive. You're dismissed. Go get your kiddos. We'll see you tomorrow.